Hi, welcome back to Basement Bible Breakdown. I'm here in my mother's basement, as some people have said, with my cheap paneling, um, bringing to you the premillennialist position and going through Revelations 20. This would be part 4. And we, to do that simple recap, of course, the idea is that Satan is imprisoned. Christ rules from Jerusalem with the saints, based on Zechariah 14. When the 1,000 years is over, Satan is released from that prison. He gathers the army. Fire comes down and devours the army of the Galilee who gathers against Jerusalem. That is where we headed into in the next few verses. And so let's start by reading verse 7 and going through there real quick. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison. Bingo! I don't see how any plainer that can be. He's in a prison. This isn't authority being bound. You can't come up with that through anything that Peter or James have said about Satan and his running around wild and coming against Christians and stuff. He's no longer deceived the nations. He is bound during this time, and now he is being released from that prison. He will come out. There's the language. Come out. Exa. Come out of that prison, to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints at the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire, where the beast and the false prophet were casted. In the Greek, there's a little bit of a question there by many people on that, actually what that is saying. And they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So let's get into this. The mill ends. That 1,000 year ends with Satan being released. Okay, think about this. Satan is being released. He's coming out. This is a definite end to that. So we're talking about a mill and a post mill, the end of the church age. This ends once and for all of those things that have been as they were beforehand. This ends in the premillennial position of Christ ruling on earth. And how does that end? Because what? The nations gather again, and we go straight into a judgment theme. There's no more of the idea that nations are coming year after year to worship the King in Jerusalem. These nations and these armies have come against Jerusalem for the last time, and God says, okay, that's enough. And the picture and the image that I get in my own thinking about, think about this. They lived under the old covenant for 5, 6, 7,000 years, whatever it might have been. The new covenant comes in, and here we are, another 2,000 years more of history of living under the new covenant. And both of these, we never saw God face to face. We've never lived them. And look at the rebellion that has always happened. In the first one, there was always a rebellion, people of God, to the point where they were destroyed. Here we come to the church age in Revelations, and God starts warning. The very first 3 chapters, of course, is warning to the churches for what? They're straying away from the truth and accepting false doctrines and straying from their first love and those different things. They're warning to the churches that the churches now are going to be judged. And that judgment comes in the way of that tribulation period, and that ends with Christ returning the earth. So here is Christ returning on the earth, and he's ruling with the saints in their vindication and the vengeance of the saints. They are ruling with him over this time period, and this time period then comes to the end, and still people are deceived and will be deceived by Satan. Now, dispensationalist says it's all Christians at this time, and Satan's going to come and fool the descendants of the Christians to survive. But literally, we're talking about the nations of people, and no different even now. Even though we don't see Christ, many people walk away from Christ and are deceived in everything. But when Satan certainly starts to act again, even though they're living in Christ's presence, they still are deceived and walk away. Where does that sound familiar from? Adam and Eve. Here they are talking and living with God face to face. We don't know how long that relationship went on before they ate of the apple and were deceived and did that. But do you understand that it was Satan who deceived Adam and Eve with lies? Even though they were face to face presence, God stepped back and allowed them to listen to the lies to make that choice. Who are you going to listen? Because if all you have is God, period, all you have is God in front of you, there is no choice. I'm choosing God because that's all I have to choose from. Here Satan is back again, and you've got a choice to either listen to his lies and fall for him, or to reject him and go after Christ. What does Peter say? To resist the devil and he will flee from you. So here's that dichotomy that's going on between those images of giving back and holding on to Christ versus being deceived again and falling for the sin. But that's what's going to happen, is the deceased nations, he gathers these armies again. Now, talk about Gog and Magog real quickly. Gog in Ezekiel is the ruler of the land of Magog, and Magog just refers simply to nations, foreign nations that come from a long distance, and that perfectly describes any nations that come against and gathers and surrounds Jerusalem. So it's a general type of a description of nations that do that. And they gather for battle or for the war, and their numbers like the sand of the sea. Again, that is the same language about Israel, Jerusalem. Abraham's descendants will be as sand of the sea, their numbers. So that imagery is there's a lot of people here, a lot. So they march up over the broad plain of the earth and surround the camp of the saints in the beloved city, but fire comes down from heaven and consumes them. Two things. In the discussion, I forgot to do this in the last post. That's where my point was going, and I forgot to do this. In that Blue Point Bible, afterwards they had a discussion. They talked about Revelations 20. Adam Marshak, Miano, Michael, none of them had an answer for the camp of the saints. Their best thing they could say was, well, this was the New Jerusalem. Think about that. If that was the New Jerusalem that had come down, they're the ones that are saying the New Jerusalem didn't come till after 70 AD. But now they want to claim that the New Jerusalem came down before the tribulation, before the beast was released and all that. So you're talking about the New Jerusalem came down during the 50s or 60s or something like that. And of course they realize that is completely inconsistent. So when it comes to Revelations 20 and all of this, I haven't found yet a preterist who knows how to deal with the idea that Jerusalem becomes the camp of the saints when they were told to flee in Matthew 24. How is it they were the camp of the saints, the city he loves, and not the Babylon of the harlot? If God divorced Jerusalem and Israel here in the millennium, why is it being called the camp of the saints? They have no answer for that inconsistency, period. That is one of the things you would bring up in a debate and sit there and say, there you go. You just lost it on that whole point. So, looking at the verses, going back then, fire came down. Now, at the end, the fire comes down from heaven and consumes them, this army. There's no picture there from 19. Here's where we get and differentiate from amill and postmill. In the postmill and all that, it's an army that comes with Christ who fights against these armies. Here you have no picture of an army. You have fire coming down from heaven and consuming them. Not an army's battling, but you get the picture of they lay siege, and before anything can happen, fire comes down and burns them up. Now, where do we get this picture of the ungodly being burnt up with fire? It comes from 2 Peter 3:5. So let's look at that real quick. And we're doing a systematic theology here. We're connecting the dots here. For they deliberately overlooked this fact that the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and through water and by the word of God, that the waters and all things were created. And so in verse 6, and that by means of this world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. Now, we're not talking about the earth being destroyed by the water, did it? But what did it do? It destroyed all the works of man. Water, look what happened to the tsunami. It destroys everything that man made. And so water in a flood destroys everything and creates almost like a clean slate when it washes off the works of man. And so here Peter is bringing up a comparison. Okay, the world was created back then by water, and by water the earth was destroyed. The creation was destroyed. And we're talking about the flood, obviously. Everything that God had created on the earth was completely destroyed. No, there's no such thing as a local flood. There's too many arguments and language within the Hebrew, and that Genesis 8 that proves that all life on earth was destroyed. There's nobody left but Noah and his sons, his 3 sons. So obviously that's a different video at a different time. But the idea is that the world of the ungodly was destroyed. Now, something I want to point out. The Jews were never called ungodly because that word actually means they have no respect for anything holy. That's the idea of ungodly. People have no respect for God, his things, or anything else. The Jews always had respect for God, even if they're not even necessarily in the rebellion as the Pharisees. They're not disrespecting God. It was because they had so much respect for God that they came against Jesus, because they saw him as disrespecting God, claiming to be God himself, which was anathema. That was, completely against the idea that Jesus, this man, was somehow or another the Messiah. They couldn't believe it. So here's that judgment that comes on there, of course, for rejecting of him. The idea then is that the ungodly are people who disrespect completely anything that has to do with godly. That is not Jews. That's what that word means. So, verse 7, going back to 2 Peter 3. So by the same word, and that word, their same word is the idea of command, a same word of command, by God's one command. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He spoke those things into existence. He said, let there be light. That is the spoken word of a command. So by the same word, the heavens and the earth that now exist, Peter is saying during his time, between 50s and 60s, when he wrote this, what? The earth that now exists are stored up for fire, to be destroyed, being kept unto the day of judgment and the destruction of the ungodly. So this day of judgment of the ungodly is that day that they surround Jerusalem the second time and bring their armies, and fire comes down. And the idea there is this whole earth is burnt up. Every person that is living on it, all the whole world of ungodly who reject God and our holy things, so that not only includes the army, but it includes all people on earth, are burnt up. They're destroyed. That's their judgment. Fire comes down. They are destroyed. It ends. If I was to go back to Revelations 20, what happens next? Fire comes down and consumes it. Then the devil who was deceived then was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were cast, or are casted, or have been cast. So here's the idea, and this is another strong evidence as why we're not talking about a recap, because before, the beast and false prophet are thrown in while when Christ returns. That's what happens to them. They're put into the lake of fire. Satan is put into a prison. He's not cast into the lake of fire. He's put into prison. Two different things. But here at the end of this, the devil, this is the end of the devil. He's cast into and thrown into the lake of fire, where the beast and the false prophet were cast. And that does not imply the idea that they are all cast in at the same time. That is what the amill and the postmill have to attend to, is that, see, this rebellion that goes on with Satan is also the same thing as the tribulation, just talked about in a different perspective. But the idea that the fire comes down and destroys all the ungodly, and we talked about Zechariah 14, the people who survive of the nations are the ones who are living through the mill. Here, there is nobody going to survive, period. Therefore, this is the man's last day on earth. All things come to this end when they are burnt up. There's no more, basically, earth. Who's living on earth? Nobody. We go right into verse 11 of 20. I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. From his presence, the earth and sky fled away, and there's no place was found for them. No place found them. Here's the separating line. The earth and sky flew away. No events are going on. The time ends. Everything, all of the destruction of the fire over the earth is remaking it. Actually, it's burning off the old things and getting rid of all the old things, and there's nobody left alive on earth to continue to live, to have babies. It's all burnt up by fire. All of the ungodly are there. The saints themselves, of course, are now in heaven. They're not the ones who are facing the judgment. They've already been judged. They have already received the promise of the redemption of their bodies. And so this judgment here about being recorded in the books for the saint, the one who has been resurrected and is alive, this is not a judgment of your deeds. I need to get that across to Christians, period. You are not being judged. All your sins are not being brought up again, and you're being judged for what you have done. That is simply not the case whatsoever. As far as the east is through the west, he has thrown our sins. He doesn't remember them anymore. What we're going to be judged on, of course, in the judgment in the Bema Seat for Christians is your works. What kind of reward are you going to get for what you did based on your obedience? I'll get back to that in a minute. But all of the ungodly are going to be judged. So I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were open. This goes back to Daniel 7, of course. The books are opened. Everybody who has ever lived is going to stand before him. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. So the books that were being opened up first are the deeds of the people of the ungodly, and looking at what they have done and what they've done wrong, and to look at and examine their lives. The other one is the book of life. Now, I'm going to continue on. I know this video might get a little bit longer, but here's the idea. The book of life is that every person who is ever going to be saved, their names was recorded in this book. No names can be added onto it. People cannot continue to be born and live and then names added to this list, because that implies that God did not know them. That would mean God is not omniscient. If people are being born and God goes, oh, I didn't know they were going to be born and saved. Oh, I got to add their names to the book. You see, that's a contradiction of God's omniscience. Secondly, on a book, it has the last page. It has the last name. Do you get the implication of that? No names can be added, so there's the last person. A book has the last page, last name, all their deeds written in it, last things. You cannot have anything more after that. This is the final judgment. There can be no people that comes in afterwards. There can be no people born afterwards, after this judgment, because it is the final judgment. That's the end of all things of life on earth, because, of course, the earth is burnt up. There's nobody left on it. So they are going to be judged according to the book of life. Now, the dead were judged by what was written in the books, according to what they had done. Their deeds are recorded of what they did wrong. Not us, Christians. Now, the sea gave up the dead that were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them. What's in the sea? We're not about the sea of humanity. What is in the sea? Bodies. People have died in the sea. Their bodies are going to come back. This is called the resurrection of the unjust. They came to life and reigned with Christ. The rest of the dead, in verse 5, did not come to life until the 1,000 years was ended. So the rest of the dead are going to come to life for this final great white throne judgment. So the sea gave up all the dead bodies who were in it. Now death and Hades, death and the Hades, the tombs of the people, their bodies, of course, are going to come out. They're going to be reunited. This is the resurrection of the unjust. That is why it's the same thing as the resurrection of the just. Both of them have to be a physical resurrection. You can't have the unjust being resurrected in Christ, becoming new believers, regenerated in a resurrection. That's an impossibility. These unjust remain unjust, even though they are resurrected physically. They remain unjust. They're not going to be saved unless you buy into the universalism crap. But that's not my point here. So each one of them judged according to what they had done. This idea that the judgment happened in 70 AD has to be completely bogus, because the resurrection of the dead is for them to face judgment afterwards for the deeds that you were done. Paul says it several times that it is appointed for man to live once and then face judgment. We always give and face judgment after we have died. I think I've talked about this before. So death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. That means there is no more tombs. There is no more Hades for spirits to go to. There is no more people then left to die. There's nobody else that can die. Otherwise, if they were to die, their body will go to the grave and their spirit into Hades if they are ungodly. But see, all of that comes to that end. So this is the second death in the lake of fire. That's where anybody's name who's not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire, where Satan was thrown to, and they will do what? Be tormented day and night forever and ever. Now, we're not talking about where God physically torments people and he forces them to go to this place, and he deliberately does things that torments these resurrected people. That is simply ludicrous. The idea is that the torment, it comes from them being in a place without God where there is no more hope. They have no more hope. They have no life. They have nothing. They are absolutely in a dark place where God does not dwell. There is no future for them. There is no nothing for them. They are getting what they deserve and what they ask for. See, the idea is that God never sends anybody to hell that didn't deserve it, nor does he force anybody to go to heaven who doesn't deserve it, and vice versa. He does not force people to go. It would be their choice. And if they reject it, they do it willingly and knowingly that they are rejecting God, knowing that they're going to end up in a place. And when they end up at that place, they can't go back and say, God, look at you, why you did it. Why did you force me to go to hell? I didn't want to go here. And if maybe, you had done something more, I wouldn't. Okay, forget it. This is the place where God says, I'm sorry, you chose to go there. I did everything in this life to prove. I came, I died, I sent my apostles, my evangelists, I sent people the word to tell you, to give you a choice. And here you are in the judgment. You're going to stand up before God and sit there, and God will point out to you, why is it you rejected me? I did everything I could to show you, to lead you. I mean, there was a church on every corner. You knew about me, you still rejected me. What's your excuse for rejecting me? Why? Well, because and it comes down to because you were selfish and stupid, and all you cared about is living your life the way you wanted to, and you could care less about God and Christ and things of those earth. You did what you wanted to do, and you rejected him. So now here you are in the place that you chose to go to. God is only giving you what you chose. So this is that's the end. Do I need to do a recap here, people? I'm going to close this video out and go back over it maybe a couple of times to listen to it and what I'm saying. If you have questions about things, I think I covered quite a bit of details in this, and I think I gave an adequate answer of why the post-mill and the a-mill cannot be true. And it has a lot to do with the idea that Christ will dwell on earth during that millennial period, and gave some adequate answers and reasons. So thank you for listening and watching. My whole point, of course, is for you to wrestle through things and to think through things and to compare things through. And you can always look them up online in different positions of the a-mill, post-mill, and you'll see that some of these questions that I have brought up and answering about just doesn't work, and especially like for preterism. I'm sorry, it does not work that you call Jerusalem Babylon and destroyed and just be found no more, but yet in chapter 20 it is the camp of the saints, the city he loves, and a new Jerusalem coming down where the saints, nobody but the saints coming back down. God did not divorce his people. I'm sorry, his whole point was to bring Israel and Jerusalem, both of them, back together to finish up his purposes and his plan for his people, to dwell with them among and on earth. That will be my next video, but this concludes Revelations 20. At a further time, of course, we'll get into Revelations 20 and 21 when we talk about the new heavens and earth. So thank you again. Have a good night. Sorry this was so long. Bless you. I'll see you on the flip side. Bye.